You have far more power over your emotions than you have ever been taught to believe. Most people think emotions simply happen to them, as if they are passengers being dragged through their own internal storms. But the truth is that emotions are signals, not shackles. They are pieces of information, not commands. When you understand what an emotion is, why it shows up, and what it is trying to alert you to, you gain the ability to respond instead of react. You can step out of instinct and step into intelligence. You can reclaim your internal space. You can beat your emotions not by fighting them, but by understanding the psychology behind them and using that understanding to create self-control, discipline, and resilience. Every emotion you have begins with a trigger, and no emotion is random. The human mind is a meaning-making machine. When something happens, your brain tries to interpret it, and that interpretation becomes a story, and that story becomes an emotional response. If someone ignores you, it is not the silence that hurts you, but the meaning your mind attaches to it. If someone criticizes you, it is not their words that cut into you, but the belief that those words must be true. Emotions bloom out of interpretation, not events. This is why two people can go through the same situation and feel completely different things. One sees a challenge, the other sees a threat. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. One sees insult, the other sees irrelevance. The emotional difference comes from the story the mind creates. The first step toward beating your emotions is stepping back far enough to see the story, not just the feeling. When you feel anger, the instinct is to attack. When you feel fear, the instinct is to retreat. When you feel insecurity, the instinct is to shrink or prove yourself. But when you shift from instinct to awareness, you suddenly gain choice. You can look at your emotional state with curiosity instead of judgment. Why did I feel that so quickly? What fear is hiding underneath? What expectation did I place on this moment? What belief is being activated right now? These questions create space between what you feel and how you respond. And that space is where control lives. Emotions are not your enemy, they are your compass. But you must learn to read the compass instead of being dragged by its needle. If anger arises, it might be telling you that a boundary has been crossed or that something matters deeply to you. If sadness shows up, it might be showing you what you value or what feels lost. If anxiety emerges, it might be signaling uncertainty, or a need for preparation, or a conflict between who you are and who you think you must be. These emotions are not weaknesses, but data. However, if you don't slow down enough to analyze the data, the emotion becomes a reaction instead of a message. In emotionally charged moments, the untrained mind tends to exaggerate, distort, or catastrophize. When something triggers you, your brain rushes to fill in gaps with the scariest or most self-critical interpretation possible. This is an ancient survival mechanism. Your brain is programmed to look for threats, not truths. It scans for danger, not accuracy. If someone is short with you, your brain might interpret it as rejection. If someone forgets to text you back, your brain might interpret it as abandonment. If someone gives you feedback, your brain might interpret it as failure. These rushed conclusions create emotional storms that are often completely disconnected from reality. Beating your emotions requires recognizing this psychological reflex and refusing to accept your first interpretation as fact. There is a difference between having an emotion and obeying an emotion. Feeling fear does not mean you are in danger. Feeling anger does not mean someone harmed you intentionally. Feeling insecurity does not mean you are inadequate. The emotion is real, but the story may not be. When you pause and question your thoughts, you interrupt the cycle. You break the automated chain reaction that usually takes you from trigger to reaction without conscious control. The more self-aware you become, the more you will notice patterns. Certain people might trigger you not because of who they are, but because they activate an old wound or insecurity. Certain situations may overwhelm you because they remind you of moments where you felt powerless in the past. Emotional triggers often come from unhealed experiences, memories, or beliefs embedded in the subconscious mind. Beating your emotions means confronting these patterns instead of blaming the world for activating them. It means acknowledging that your emotional responses often say more about your internal landscape than the external situation. Many people fear their emotions because they have never been taught how to handle them. They either suppress their feelings or become consumed by them. Suppression leads to numbness, resentment, and eventually a kind of emotional explosion after too much has been bottled up. Being consumed by emotions leads to impulsive decisions, damaged relationships, and a constant sense of instability. Emotional strength is not suppression or overexpression, it is regulation. Regulation means recognizing what you feel, honoring it, understanding it, and then deciding what to do with it. Imagine yourself as the guardian of your internal space. Every thought, every feeling, every trigger is something that crosses the boundary into your mind. You cannot always control what knocks on the door, but you can control what you allow to stay. This is where discipline comes in. Emotional discipline is the ability to choose your response even when your body and mind are urging you toward instinctive reactions. It means refusing to let someone else's behavior dictate your mood. It means refusing to let your fears dictate your actions. It means refusing to let insecurity dictate your worth. Discipline is not coldness, it is responsibility. One of the most powerful tools you can develop is the ability to pause. The pause is your shield. The pause is your power. The pause is the moment where you redirect the emotional current instead of being pulled by it. When you pause, you breathe. When you pause, you think. When you pause, you choose. The pause transforms you from reactive to responsive. It prevents you from speaking words that you will later regret, making decisions from insecurity, or acting out of fear or rage. A controlled pause is stronger than any emotional impulse because it reestablishes you as the authority within yourself. Understanding your triggers also requires honesty. You must be willing to confront the parts of yourself that feel fragile, threatened, or uncertain. Many people avoid this work because it requires vulnerability. But vulnerability is not weakness, it is awareness, and awareness is strength. You cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. If you want emotional mastery, you must be willing to examine your emotional wounds without shame. You must be willing to see where your reactions come from. You must be willing to admit when your emotions are speaking from fear instead of truth. The people who appear calm and composed are not emotionless. They are practiced. They have learned how to sit with their feelings without being taken over by them. They have learned how to distinguish between the emotion and the action. They have learned that emotional mastery is not about winning against the world, but about winning against themselves. That is what makes emotional resilience so powerful. It is not about shutting emotions down, but about rising above their chaos. When you learn to observe your emotions, something extraordinary happens. You realize that many of your emotional reactions are habits. Your mind has been conditioned over years to react certain ways, and these reactions are automatic. But habits can be rewritten. Conditioning can be reprogrammed. Emotional reflexes can be retrained. You are not stuck with the emotional patterns you grew up with. You are not bound to the reactions that were modeled for you. You are not defined by the emotional impulses you once obeyed. You can teach your mind a new way of being. Part of beating your emotions is learning the difference between what is in your control and what is not. You cannot control what others think, say, or do. You cannot control the past or predict the future. You cannot control whether someone understands you, respects you, or values you. But you can control how you interpret situations. You can control your inner dialogue. You can control how you speak to yourself. You can control the energy you give to certain thoughts. You can control your behavior, your mindset, your presence, and your resilience. Focusing on what you can control immediately reduces emotional overwhelm because it shifts your attention from powerlessness to strength. A major cause of emotional instability is attachment to expectations. Expectations create rigid emotional reactions. When people fail your expectations, you feel disappointed. When situations do not match your expectations, you feel frustrated. When outcomes are different from your expectations, you feel defeated. but expectations are imagined stories about how life should unfold. The more attached you are to those stories, the more emotional turbulence you face. Letting go of rigid expectations does not mean lowering your standards. It means staying adaptive and grounded in reality instead of losing yourself in imagined scenarios. Another factor that fuels emotional chaos is internal pressure. Many people believe they must always say the right thing, never make mistakes, perform perfectly, or earn their worth through external validation. This internal pressure creates anxiety, self-criticism, and emotional exhaustion. Emotional mastery requires relieving yourself of unrealistic internal demands. You do not have to be unshakable to be strong. You do not have to be perfect to be worthy. You do not have to be emotionless to be in control. Allowing room for humanity eases emotional tension and makes discipline sustainable. You beat your emotions not through force, but through understanding. You become strong not by shutting down, but by waking up. You gain control not by rejecting what you feel, but by learning the mind behind the feeling. And you begin this journey by paying attention to what rises within you, without judging it, without running from it, and without surrendering to it. Once you begin to understand your emotional triggers and the stories beneath them, the next step is learning how to master the emotional energy itself. Emotional mastery is not about becoming detached from your humanity. It is about becoming skilled with your internal experience. The same way an athlete learns to control their breath, their posture, and their focus under pressure, you learn to control your inner climate. You learn to stay centered when the world tries to pull you off balance. You learn to remain steady even when everything inside you wants to react. The strength you develop comes from discipline, not denial, and from clarity, not coldness. There is a psychological principle called emotional granularity, and it refers to your ability to identify what you feel with precision. People with low granularity describe everything with vague labels such as angry, sad, stressed, or upset. But these broad terms create mental fog. When your emotional vocabulary is limited, your responses become limited too. But when you sharpen your granularity, you become far more capable of managing what you feel. Anger might actually be disappointment. Stress might be overwhelm. Sadness might be loneliness. Frustration might be fear, disguised as irritation. When you name your emotions correctly, you take back power because you are no longer reacting to a vague cloud, but to something you can understand, address, and transform. Emotional mastery also requires you to regulate your physiological state. Every emotional surge has a physical component. Your breathing changes, your heart rate increases, your muscles tighten, and your thoughts speed up. If you ignore these physiological cues, your emotions will escalate until they overtake you. But if you intervene early, you regain control. Slow and controlled breathing, for example, sends a signal to your nervous system that you are safe. Relaxing your shoulders tells your brain that threat mode is unnecessary. Slowing your speech prevents your mind from racing. These are not small actions. They are psychological strategies that reshape your emotional experience. The body and mind are intertwined, and using one to regulate the other is one of the most effective tools you possess. Another key part of emotional self-control is challenging your initial interpretation. When something triggers you, your first thought is rarely the most accurate one. It is usually the most emotional one. Your mind might jump to conclusions out of habit, fear, or insecurity. Someone forgets to call you, and your mind assumes rejection. Someone disagrees with you, and your mind assumes hostility. Someone is distant, and your mind assumes they are losing interest. But these interpretations are emotional guesses, not truths. When you challenge your assumptions, you disrupt the emotional spiral before it gains momentum. Ask yourself if there are other explanations. Ask yourself if your reaction is rooted in past experiences rather than the present reality. Ask yourself if the story you are telling yourself is fair, logical, or evidence-based. This process does not eliminate emotion, but it neutralizes the distortion that intensifies it. Emotional self-control is also built through tolerance. Many people react impulsively not because their emotions are unbearable, but because they have never learned to tolerate discomfort. Emotional discomfort is like a wave. It rises, peaks, and falls. But if you panic at the rise, you react before the wave naturally passes. The ability to sit with discomfort without immediately acting on it is a hallmark of resilience. When you practice tolerating emotional waves, you begin to see that many feelings lose power when you do not feed them with impulsive behavior. Anger fades when you do not escalate it. Anxiety softens when you do not resist it. Sadness becomes manageable when you do not fear it. The wave becomes smaller when you ride it instead of drowning in it. Mastering your emotions also involves reframing your internal dialogue. The way you speak to yourself shapes your psychological state. If your self-talk is fear-based, critical, or catastrophic, your emotional response will follow that tone. But if your self-talk is grounded, calm, and rational, your emotional state stabilizes. For example, instead of thinking this is too much, shift to, I can handle this one step at a time. Instead of thinking they are rejecting me, shift to, I do not know their perspective yet. Instead of thinking everything is going wrong, shift to, I can respond with clarity. These internal reframes act as anchors that keep you grounded even when emotion tries to pull you into chaos. Another powerful tool for emotional mastery is creating internal boundaries. Most people understand physical boundaries, but emotional boundaries are equally important. An emotional boundary is the ability to separate what you feel from what someone else feels, or what you think from what someone else does. Without emotional boundaries, you absorb other people's moods, projections, and behaviors as if they are your own. If someone is upset, you think you caused it. If someone is distant, you think you did something wrong. If someone is unhappy, you try to fix it. But emotional boundaries allow you to say, this is their emotion, not mine, and this is their behavior, not my responsibility. This separation gives you the power to remain stable even when others are not. Practicing emotional neutrality is another form of strength. Emotional neutrality does not mean indifference. It means not personalizing everything. When someone is rude, it says more about them than you. When someone withdraws, it might be tied to their own battles. When someone reacts explosively, it may be a reflection of their internal chaos. Emotional neutrality allows you to evaluate situations logically rather than emotionally. It creates mental distance that protects you from unnecessary hurt. It helps you stay objective and prevents the world from having too much power over your internal state. To master emotional self-control, you must also work on your triggers proactively, not only reactively. This means building a lifestyle and mindset that strengthen your psychological baseline. A regulated nervous system and a disciplined mind are less likely to be thrown off by external stressors. Sleep, nutrition, movement, and stillness are often dismissed in emotional conversations, but they are foundational. When your body is depleted, your emotions become louder. When your mind is overstimulated, your reactions become sharper. When your life lacks structure, your emotional world becomes chaotic. Strength is built through daily habits that make emotional resilience your default mode, not just your crisis mode. Another dimension of emotional mastery comes from choosing your emotional focus. The human brain has a negativity bias, meaning it naturally focuses more on threats than opportunities. This bias is designed to protect you, but it can also distort your emotional world. When you learn to shift your focus toward what you can influence, what is working, and what is aligned with your growth, your emotional state becomes more balanced. This does not mean ignoring problems. It means refusing to let them dominate your internal landscape. There is also the skill of emotional detachment. Emotional detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You stop clinging to outcomes, opinions, expectations, or fears. You detach from external validation and anchor yourself in internal validation. You detach from the need to control everything and focus on controlling yourself. You detach from the constant desire to be understood and understand yourself instead. Detachment frees you from emotional chains because it takes your power back from external conditions. Another essential psychological strategy is practicing delayed reaction. In emotionally charged situations, the first few seconds determine everything. If you react instantly, you usually react emotionally. But if you delay your reaction, even briefly, you regain control. This delay allows your rational mind to come back online. It gives you time to check your story, regulate your breath, and choose your tone. Delayed reaction is one of the most underrated but effective tools for maintaining composure, especially in conflict or high-pressure environments. Emotional mastery also comes from building a strong sense of self. When you know who you are not easily shaken by what you feel. When you trust yourself, you do not panic at every emotional shift. When you have a grounded identity, you do not look to emotions to define your worth or your decisions. Many emotional reactions come from insecurity, from the fear of being judged, abandoned, or not good enough. Strengthening your identity dissolves these vulnerabilities. You become anchored, and anchored people do not drift emotionally every time the world changes direction. Another part of emotional self-control involves embracing discomfort as a training tool. Growth always requires a level of discomfort. Discipline requires discomfort. Self-awareness requires discomfort. Learning new emotional patterns requires discomfort. When you stop avoiding discomfort and start using it as a form of emotional conditioning, your resilience expands. You learn that discomfort is not danger, but development. You learn that fear is not a command, but a signal. You learn that sadness is not a collapse, but a reflection. You learn that anger is not destruction, but information. This shift transforms emotional experiences into opportunities for growth instead of threats to your stability. Mastering your emotions also requires you to let go of the urge to win every emotional moment. Not every conflict needs your rebuttal. Not every insult needs your defense. Not every misunderstanding needs your explanation. Sometimes emotional control is choosing silence over reaction. Sometimes it is choosing to walk away instead of escalating. Sometimes it is choosing self-respect over being right. These choices may feel difficult in the moment, but they build long-term emotional authority. Every moment you choose composure over chaos, you strengthen your internal leadership. When you practice all of these skills consistently, emotional self-control becomes your natural state instead of a forced effort. You become someone who feels deeply but responds wisely. You become someone who experiences emotion but does not crumble under it. You become someone who can navigate emotional storms with clarity, presence, and strength. And once you reach this level of mastery, you are ready to apply disciplined psychological strategies that elevate your emotional intelligence into unshakable resilience. As you move into disciplined psychological strategies, the focus shifts from understanding and regulating your emotions to consciously directing them. This is the stage where you stop putting out emotional fires and start preventing them altogether. It is where emotional mastery evolves into emotional command. This is not about becoming rigid or closed off. It is about developing a mind that does not collapse under pressure and a spirit that does not get hijacked by impulses. It is about becoming someone who carries internal stability everywhere you go, regardless of what you face. One of the most powerful strategies is mental reframing. Mental reframing means shifting the meaning you assign to an experience so you can shift your emotional response. Every emotion grows from interpretation, so every emotion can be transformed by reinterpretation. If someone criticizes you, instead of absorbing it as a wound, you can see it as feedback you can choose to use or discard. If someone disappoints you, instead of collapsing into sadness or resentment, you can see their behavior as clarity. If a situation feels overwhelming, you can reframe it as training. When you practice reframing, you are not pretending things are better than they are. You are choosing the interpretation that strengthens you. You are choosing the frame that keeps you grounded. Another strategy is developing emotional detachment from outcomes. Many emotional storms come from being overly attached to how things should turn out. You expect people to act a certain way, and when they do not, you react emotionally. You expect plans to unfold smoothly, and when they do not, you panic or spiral. You expect validation, approval, or closure, and when you do not receive it, your emotional balance collapses. But when you detach from outcomes and focus on your actions, your choices, and your presence, your emotional center remains intact. You stop giving external events the power to dictate your internal state. You stop tying your peace to circumstances you cannot control. One of the strongest forms of emotional discipline is strategic self-talk. Your mind responds to the language you use. If you speak to yourself in a tone of fear, you activate anxiety. If you speak to yourself in a tone of helplessness, you activate resignation. If you speak to yourself with harshness, you activate shame or defensiveness. But when you speak to yourself with clear, grounded, and authoritative inner language, you stabilize your thoughts. You regain clarity. Self-talk is not about repeating empty affirmations. It is about creating a psychological environment where you can think, choose, and respond with intention. A steady inner voice builds a steady emotional state. Another key strategy is what behavioral psychologists call exposure with control. Many people live their lives avoiding emotionally triggering situations because they fear losing control, but avoidance reinforces fear. The way to build emotional resilience is to expose yourself to discomfort in controlled ways. Have difficult conversations. Sit with disappointment without catastrophizing. Allow yourself to feel anger without reacting impulsively. Engage in challenges that stretch your emotional capacity. Every time you face discomfort without fleeing or exploding, your emotional tolerance expands. You teach your brain that you can handle moments that once overwhelmed you. This training transforms your emotional baseline and increases your strength. Emotional command also requires developing a long-term vision for your identity. When you know who you are becoming, momentary emotions lose power. A clear identity creates stability because it gives you something to anchor into when emotions fluctuate. Ask yourself who you want to be under pressure. Ask yourself what version of yourself you want to show up as when you feel triggered. Ask yourself how the strongest, most self-disciplined version of you would respond in moments of discomfort. When you identify the person you are becoming, your emotions no longer dictate your behavior. Your identity does. This shift is transformative. Another essential strategy is practicing psychological distance. Psychological distance means stepping outside your perspective and viewing the situation as an observer instead of a victim. When you distance yourself mentally, your emotional intensity decreases automatically. You can imagine the situation as if it were happening to a friend and consider the advice you would give them. You can imagine that you are watching the moment unfold in a movie rather than experiencing it directly. These mental techniques reduce the emotional charge and allow your rational mind to guide your response. Psychological distance helps you see truth instead of only feeling emotion. Emotional command also requires you to build internal standards for how you want to think, behave, and respond. When you have standards, you no longer react impulsively. You respond based on principle. Instead of letting anger decide your tone, your standards decide it. Instead of letting insecurity guide your words, your standards guide them. Standards create consistency. They eliminate the chaos that comes from shifting emotional states. They help you maintain dignity even in difficult situations. When you hold yourself to a personal code, you rise above emotional turbulence because you have already decided who you are. Another powerful technique is intentional emotional processing. Emotional discipline does not mean ignoring your feelings until they disappear. It means processing them in ways that are productive rather than destructive. After a triggering moment, give yourself time to reflect. Ask yourself what you felt, why you felt it, and what the emotion was trying to signal. This reflection helps integrate the emotional lesson instead of suppressing the emotional experience. When you process feelings intentionally, they no longer accumulate into bitterness, resentment, or reactivity. They dissolve because the mind has extracted the information it needed. Emotional mastery also requires learning the psychology of energy. Emotions are a form of energy, and where your attention goes, energy flows. If you give energy to resentment, the resentment grows. If you give energy to fear, the fear expands. If you give energy to insecurity, the insecurity intensifies. But if you redirect your energy toward purpose, growth, presence, and peace, those states expand instead. You must learn to be selective about where you invest your emotional energy. Not every situation deserves your reaction. Not every person deserves your emotional labor. Not every thought deserves your attention. Emotional command is partly about emotional budgeting. Where you invest determines what grows. Another strategy is mastering your environment. Emotional stability is easier when your environment supports it. Chaos breeds emotional reactivity. Clutter increases stress. Toxic people amplify insecurity. Constant distraction raises anxiety. When you create a structured environment, both internally and externally, your emotional world becomes easier to manage. Clean your space, protect your time, limit your exposure to people who drain you, create routines that support your mental clarity. Structure is not restriction. Structure is emotional safety. Emotional command also requires practicing internal sovereignty. Internal sovereignty means you take full responsibility for your inner world. You stop blaming others for your reactions. You stop expecting people to regulate your emotions for you. You stop placing your peace in external hands. Internal sovereignty makes you emotionally unshakable because your stability is self-sourced. When you own your reactions, your healing, your growth, and your discipline, no one can take your power away. Another essential strategy is maintaining composure under pressure. Composure is not about appearing calm. It is about being grounded in your body and clear in your mind. When you feel emotional intensity rising, check your posture. Straighten your spine. Lower your shoulders. Slow your breathing. This physical grounding helps your mind regain clarity. Composure sends a psychological message to your brain that you are safe, capable, and in control. When you maintain composure consistently, people respond to you differently. They feel your presence. They feel your steadiness. They feel the strength beneath your calm. Emotional command also involves embracing silence as a tool. Silence gives you time to think. Silence reduces emotional escalation. Silence reveals truth because people expose themselves when you stop filling the space. Silence is not weakness, it is strategy. When you choose silence in an emotional moment, you are refusing to let impulse guide you. You are allowing your intelligence to lead. Silence protects your dignity, your clarity, and your power. Another strategy is cultivating mental stillness. Your emotions become loud when your mind is overcrowded. Stillness is the art of clearing mental noise so emotional clarity can emerge. Stillness does not require meditation or rituals. It requires presence. It requires training your attention to focus on one thing at a time. It requires stepping away from overstimulation and reconnecting with your breath, your thoughts, and your intentions. Stillness is the foundation of emotional resilience because it gives you access to your rational mind, even in chaos. One of the most transformative disciplines is self-respect. When you truly respect yourself, your emotions align with that respect. You do not allow people to walk over your boundaries. You do not chase validation. You do not tolerate disrespect. You do not settle for emotional crumbs. You do not abandon yourself to keep the peace. Self-respect stabilizes your emotional world because it sets a standard for how you allow yourself to be treated. When you honor yourself, emotions stop controlling you because your choices are guided by dignity, not desperation. Another foundational strategy is emotional accountability. Accountability means you recognize your role in your emotional reactions. It means you acknowledge when you overreact, misinterpret, or project. It means you correct your behavior instead of justifying it. Accountability transforms emotional impulsivity into emotional maturity. It makes you more trustworthy to yourself. It builds internal confidence because you know you can grow, adapt, and improve. Accountability turns emotional chaos into emotional intelligence. As you develop all of these strategies, something profound happens. You stop fearing your emotions. You stop seeing them as threats. You stop feeling overwhelmed by them. Instead, you become someone who can feel deeply but think clearly. You become someone who can experience emotional intensity without losing composure. You become someone whose presence calms chaos rather than feeds it. This transformation changes how you move through the world. It changes how you handle conflict, stress, relationships, pressure, and uncertainty. You operate from a place of strength instead of reactivity. This is the essence of beating your emotions. You do not eliminate what you feel. You elevate how you respond. You rise above the emotional storms instead of getting caught inside them. You return to your grounded center no matter what tries to pull you away from it. You become the calm in the chaos, the clarity in the confusion, the steadiness in the storm. And that is where true power lives. You now understand your triggers. You know how to regulate your emotional state. And you have the psychological strategies to maintain discipline, stability, and resilience in any situation. This is emotional leadership. This is the strength of an unshakable mind. This is how you beat your emotions and become the author of your own internal world.